Welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. I hope that everyone had a chance to, if not read the first 16 chapters, at least have a chance to get the book. It's a wonderful book about Dr. Lowe, as those that have read it know. And we're going to talk about chapters 1 through 16 today. And then in March, it's actually the same date. We're going to go through chapter 17 through 34. And so here is a little information. I know Linda was kind enough to fill you in a little bit about the history of the book, but it was written by Neil and Margaret Rau, and they were introduced to Recovery International by an article they read by Harry Nelson, a Los Angeles Times medical writer. And they thought it was an interesting story, and they wanted to learn more about it. So that's how their interest got piqued. And I don't know, Celinda, if you said some more backstory than what I just read this in the book itself. But they actually, to write the book, decided to go ahead and be trained to be authorized group leaders so they can better describe and understand the method, which I thought was a great and wonderful thing that they did. Makes it more authentic and more, that they really understand and sympathize and empathized with the patients in Recovery International or members. So when they were writing the book, the RI president, Treasure Rice, helped provide invaluable editing. The book was published on January 1st, 1971. So the research included interviews and personal accounts with Dr. Lowe's family members, including his wife and daughters, his sister-in-law and nephew, and with the doctors and nurses and personal friends of Dr. Lowe's. He also got help from Recovery International staff at the time, or they got help from Recovery International staff, and they were sent hundreds of stories from different recovery members from around the country, and they agreed to share their personal stories and permission to share it in the book. And they also gave permission to use their full names, which, as we know, the stigma was very strong, even though this was probably in the late 60s when they started. I'm not sure, it doesn't, but anyways, so I thought that was interesting point that people would share their stories. So we're going to just talk a little bit about the different sections that were in the book. The first section was the early years of Dr. Lowe. That the first couple of chapters dealt with. So as you know, he was born in Baranów, Poland in 1891, which was quite a long time ago, on February 28th. So his birthday's coming up soon. And as Lisa knows, she has a big happy birthday poster in her office to Dr. Lowe. To Jewish Orthodox Jewish parents that were born into Orthodox Jewish faith or families, his parents were. So their names were Lazar Lowe and Bluma Wall. And I thought it was interesting that his mom had 13 children. Can you imagine? 13, and only 9 of those lived. Which 9, I mean, only 9. I mean, that's a lot of
That's a
kids.
lot.
Unfortunately, his father was a heavy drinker and also had a lot of temper himself and had a lot of temper outburst with his family. Unfortunately, her husband was also an entrepreneur, but he didn't have very much success with his financial life just really didn't ever click. And after one of his many financial failures, Dr. Lowe's mother dies at only 39 years of age. So you can imagine at 39, a lot of her children were still young children at home. So when that happened, the father decided to move. I believe I don't have that written down, but they moved back to Poland, but he couldn't bring all 9 kids and take care of them. So he decided to split up the family, and he put 4 of the kids into orphanages. 2 went to one and 2 went, and Dr. Lowe and with one of his brothers, went into another orphanage. So the kids really got pulled apart at that time. He has a their family ties ran very deep, as we find out when they get back to America or when they move to America, and how the family really supported each other throughout the years. It was really quite amazing, especially since they didn't seem to have a very good childhood with their parents, that they were able to still stay close to each other and support each other. I thought that was a very interesting sub story, besides Dr. Lowe's story himself. So, like I said, his family really supported each other, and they decide that Abraham should become a doctor. And so they, make arrangements so that he is able to do that. And he enters the University of Strasbourg, and he goes on to medical school at the University of Vienna. And for those of you that may not have heard, the University of Vienna is the same school that is it that one of these two schools is the same school that Dr. Freud went to, Sigmund Freud. So that's kind of an interesting note, but it was 13 years apart. In his education experience, he did get conscripted to the Austrian army during World War I. And so he had to stop his studies. And when he first entered, he had some discrimination against him since he was of Jewish descent, and he was only able to serve as a private in the army until there was an emergency, and they realized that Dr. Lowe had gone some medical experience, and then he became a medic and had to practice a lot of medicine. Had to practice as a doctor in World War II.
World
That was
One.
over his head. He had to perform a lot of things that he really wasn't trained yet for. So he really suffered a lot of hardship during this time of his life. And he returns to Europe, and soon his family starts migrating to America, and he decides to move to America with his young sister, Fanny, and they move into an apartment in New York. And that's a very interesting, dynamic there with all the different ages and kids living together. He does become licensed to practice in 1922 and was able to set up a practice. He was a very intelligent person, as we read, and he was also very committed to, when he got into something, he became very committed. And he was very interested in Zionism, and that's starting an Israeli state. And he was busy giving lectures to Zionist organizations. He started that in Europe, and he continued when he first moved to the US. And he was busy giving lectures to different Zionist organizations in New York. So Dr. Lowe spoke 7 languages, and he was lecturing at a German intellectualist group on psychoanalysis. Then after a time, Dr. Lowe he follows a woman to Buffalo, New York, and he was in love, and then the romance cooled, and he decided, instead of going back to New York, that he would move to Chicago. And he moves in with his sister, Selma, who lived there at that time, and he set up practice in a room above a drugstore across the streets. And he really enjoyed his lecturing series, so he begins to start lecturing again to friends and colleagues. And they mentioned he had a wide variety of interest in philosophy and different playwrights, but one of his favorite subjects to talk about was Shakespeare and the different Shakespearean characters. So he was quite a diverse personality and had a lot of different interests and capabilities. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this is a little bit about his career highlights. Of course, I couldn't get them all down, and I only went through the first 16 chapters, so there's probably some that are yet to come. But in 1925, in the Chicago area, Dr. George Boris Hassan invites Dr. Lowe to join the staff at the University of Illinois Medical School. He's to teach in the neurology department and do research in the field of histopathy, which is the study of cells, which I had to look up. Because he was involved with the medical school, he closed his private practice at that time. And there was another well-known and very prestigious and doctor named Dr. Singer that had a lot of influence in Dr. Lowe's life, and he was the head of a lot of different organizations over Dr. Lowe's lifetime. And Dr. Singer really saw the genius in Dr. Lowe and was always very interested in bringing Dr. Lowe along when he needed someone to fill an important position. So in 1931, Dr. Singer opens the Psychiatric Institute in a wing of the Research and Educational Hospital in Chicago. And as a result of Dr. Lowe's articles published in the Archives of Neurology, Dr. Singer cannot think of anyone better than Dr. Lowe to staff at the new Psychiatric Institute. In 1932, Dr. Singer is asked by the governor of Illinois to be the state alienist to reform the psychiatric wards of the state hospitals. And Dr. Singer says yes, but with one condition only, that Dr. Lowe must join him as an assistant. So that's how he became assistant state alienist. And that job did take him around the state of Illinois, and he visited all the state hospitals in Illinois at that time. So, we start getting into, at this point, the history of Recovery International. Of course, it had a lot of different names as we read in the book. So I'm just going to refer for ease, I'm going to call it the Recovery International. So as a state alienist, Dr. Lowe came across all kinds and degrees of illnesses. He found in his meeting with patients across these hospitals, he found that the right choice of words had the power to mobilize a patient's will to health. So that is kind of that beginning of recovery's foundation, use your will to get better. And 1933, Dr. Lowe starts having patients and staff meet in groups. This was really to help save time. He was very busy. He traveled and he was still part of the university. And he was, starting a family at that point. So he started having everybody meet in groups. So he found it was more efficient that way. He wasn't the first to practice group psychotherapy, but he was one of the few that was doing group psychotherapy at the time. In his travels to the state hospital, he became interested in patients with more serious cases. And these are people that were cut off from their families and really the world in general. They might have not been able to talk anymore. So these are the sickest of the sick that he really started to be concerned about and wanting to find something that could help them get better. So in studying these cases, Dr. Lowe became convinced that these patients could be suffering from a physiological disorder and not just a psychological disorder as it was thought at the time. He is not alone in this theory, and he starts studying the works of other psychiatrists. As you know, these people were institutionalized, they were shut away and forgotten about, and just maybe their basic needs were taken care of in these hospitals, but there really wasn't any treatment for them. It's very sad to think about in hard times what these people must have had to suffer through, endure, and at that time. So let's see, go to the next slide. So this is beginnings of recovery continue. In 19, Dr. Lowe hears about these new treatments, because he started studying about people, other psychiatrist treatments of the really chronically sick. And he himself in 1936 starts to treat his patients with insulin and metrazole shock treatments. Um, he found that he was getting some dramatic results from these treatments, and they were really were the final proof to Dr. Lowe, the inherent errors in the psychoanalytical school of thought, where all of the psychological problems came from trauma. So he understood now that there are also physiological problems that people were suffering from, and these insulin and metrazole shock treatments were really helping people recover. What he found that after these insulin or shock treatments, patients still needed something. They really were able to maybe connect with the world in a way that they hadn't maybe for their whole life, but they really weren't all the way better where they could go out and get released from a hospital and go out into the world. So he realized that these patients still needed to have training in order to develop the personality traits that could help the patient live a normal life. And, it just really shows how much he cared for people and how he wanted to help mankind live a better life. He was quite an individual. Um, One thing he also found, Dr. Lowe was very interested in language. He studied he spoke a lot of different languages. He gave lectures. He studied playwrights. So, language was a very important part of his life. He was a prolific reader. There's even a section in the book where it talks about his whole apartment was filled with books, even to the point where he had books in his refrigerator. I mean, it was kind of humorous. Um, but Dr. Lowe realizes how powerful language is in treating patients, and he starts to introduce the concept of duality in his treatments, that in nature and in language, there are always pairs of opposites, and you can't really understand one without having the other. So there's right and there's wrong, there's effort and there's comfort. I can remember in high school, I had a science teacher or junior high, that was like, you can't tell how tall somebody is unless you have something to compare them to. So this is kind of the same. You need to know that there's always one side and then the other. So as we keep reading in the book, another section is about there is quite a few case studies or personal stories about some of the patients of Dr. Lowe at this time, and a couple of very important ones that were very sick when they came under Dr. Lowe's care was Joe Janis and Harlan Tarbell. Both patients were able to regain their health. I see a typo, and return to a normal life. So they were two very important patients in the development of recovery and the recovery organization. In 1937, what was happening is many of the patients that Dr. Lowe was treating with the shock treatments were returning to the Psychiatric Institute so they would have shock treatments and training, and they would go back to their everyday, their family setting. And what was happening, it describes as these patients, and then they had to come back to the hospital for further training and aftercare. But even after that time period was over, the patients still wanted to come back to the Psychiatric Institute on their own initiative. Although they were cured of their chronic illness, they still had the stigma of mental illness. And they all came to Dr. Lowe for help. And this is how recovery started, as these patients that were returning to the hospital in a crowded meeting one night, filled with patients, family members, and staff, it was decided that an organization would be established headed by Dr. Lowe. The organization had three goals: to provide a social outlet for the patients, to help the staff stay connected to patients, and because, as you know, this was all in its infancy, curing mental health patients, and a means to battle the public's ignorance of mental illness. So that was an important meeting that night. So reducing stigma, that was an important part of the recovery organization's mission. So there are several things that stood out to me in the reading that helped reduce stigma. First is that in 1938, Dr. Lowe starts a magazine called Lost and Found. And because of this publication, there were other sister organizations that were founded in other cities in Illinois. Dr. Lowe also, as busy as he starts training family members of his patients and began delivering lectures, which was a novel approach at this time. I think he did this on Sunday afternoons. And what happened was his wife and children would go to these meetings because they really had very little time with him alone. And this was so a chance for them to get to be with Dr. Lowe. And I think maybe it is another reason why they were so committed to recovery after his passing, because they had been a part of these family meetings and so much a part of of getting to know some of his patients and their fathers and husbands' work. So it had some cute descriptions of Phyllis, I think, running up and down the hallways. And I think there's also, I know that they would go to some of the social gatherings. Linda might know a little bit more about that, but I know that their families were the Lowe family was very interwoven with Dr. Lowe's work. So we're lucky for that, because I think they did really want to continue his legacy after his passing. Recovery members, Dr. Lowe was working with several other, a doctor and a lawyer, to help get the commitment laws and antiquated language changed in Illinois' commitment laws, mental health commitment. And he reaches out to his recovery members, and they joined the fight, and they donated quite a bit of money to that cause. And this was during the Depression. So it was very interesting that they dug deep and were just as committed as he was to better the condition for mental health patients. And he also, in 1939, it describes several articles that were published about Dr. Lowe and recovery. There was some written by a medical writer or a psychiatrist, and another one that was written by a layperson. But especially the articles that were written by the doctor, they were not well received, because they renounced the psychoanalytic method and were talking more about his hands-on approach. So those articles were not well received, even though Dr. Lowe had a lot of hope that a lot of different psychiatrists around the country would read about his success and want to implement some of his methods, but that was not to come at this point. He also did present at the American Psychiatric Association at a convention that was in Chicago, and also several patients came and set up a booth to give out information about recovery. And that's a tradition that still goes on today. I don't know if anybody here had to put a resource fair together, but it's very rewarding. And I think having patients there giving out the information and answering questions is very more impactful than having maybe staff that are not in recovery. Okay, so there's a couple of chapters on the patient's involvement in recovery, but I realized I would be running out of time. So I didn't really get into chapters 14, 15, and 16 here. I thought I would tag some of this information on the next time we get together, but you're welcome to bring anything up that you read. In fact, because I wanted to go into this portion of the meeting. And I wanted to have a chance for all of you to give your thoughts, maybe some insights you gained about Dr. Lowe or the recovery method, how you felt about reading this book. Did it impact you? Did you think about it? And so I wrote up a couple questions, but what I really wanted to do was take us off of share, and we could have more of a book club discussion.
I think that a guy as gifted as he was intellectually saw a new movement with the Freudian psychoanalyst um, movement. He was right there in Vienna. It was right. It was right there, and this was going to be a new field. This is going to be a new science, and it had to be challenging to somebody as gifted as he was in languages, intellect. Um, and so when you see somebody like him and he sees something like that, that's an opportunity.
Um, as I was reading the book, I saw his father had a problem, the drinking problem. He had a bad attitude. He went through his family was split up. That's a trauma, that they went through. Um, in the military, he saw all this. I think that his childhood experience as he grew up, he was such a compassionate person and he wanted to help so many people. He's always there, and he thought psychiatry was one way he can help humanity.
I think what added to it was the fact that he had some sensitivities and nervous habits that he experienced, but he was able to turn them around and recognize why and where some of it was coming from and how to change that. So I think he wanted to help others with what he discovered for himself about his own nervous stuff.
I think most people get into the field because of personal need is the ulterior motive. That's what I think. And then if you have intellect and intuition working together, the sky's the limit, creativity.
Yeah, he was such a studier of philosophy, and like Colette just said, he had a lot of creative capacity here, and I think he had a very high level intuition, so he saw beyond what was just presented. Let's say, just say on paper, on cases, he could see beyond layers. Because when you read the book, you sort of see how he could see into the patients, before they even knew what they saw themselves, and that's part of the whole, where his genius came in. He was very, I guess we would call him like a very enlightened being is the language I would say, with just his genius and what he could learn and the information he could receive and then translate and create something out of that, which was this method.
Do you have any comments or any impressions about his relationships with his brothers and sisters, even though they had they were able to really stay together as a family? Does anybody want to make any comment about that, or did it impress anybody?
I would say that that's part of the method about group mindedness, and maybe that spot we get, the stronger the link, the stronger the symptoms,
Right.
the stronger the spotting needs to be. Like he got symptoms being around his family, but he knew that that was a place where he could be. But I also think that maybe they saw who he was to go to college, so he maybe needed to, not excessive duty and responsibility, but to be part to bring everybody together again. Just my thought.
Yeah, and I was kind of comparing it and contrasting it to today's times and what families were all about back then. As immigrants, how they rely upon each other for support, his two brothers that came to America were sending money back to the family. A cousin, I believe, too. I mean, it's just really incredible that they were able to they really supported each other and wanted to make sure everybody succeeded and everybody was taken care of, and everybody, had their basic needs covered. And I think that, we kind of came away from that in present times. I in the U.S., I mean, we're known to be individuals and kind of try to succeed as individuals.
Yeah, I think the size of his family, the siblings, that probably contributed to his wanting to get into psychiatry. Having to interact with so many people, and he was kind of like the peacekeeper, I think. I just think that that's probably what contributed to his initial interest in psychiatry, was having to deal with being in the middle of all of those siblings.
I see, he was so caring with his patients. He fought for them and just worked so hard for them. And it was a similar thing with his family. I think he got that growing up, the whole sense of family and the group mindedness. And he carried that over into his professional work, and people heard that and felt that was really important to him and to them. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, so I have another question here. I don't know if anybody has anything to say about why do you think his colleagues rejected his work? He was so wanted so much to recovery, as he saw a lot of people getting well. He wanted it so bad to be accepted by other psychiatrists and maybe go to other state hospitals. Stu?
His method was totally new. It was revolutionary. It takes a long time for anything new to get into in any area of the medical field. It has to be proven before it's accepted by colleagues.
Also, the fact that the psychoanalytic way was very ego-friendly to the psychiatrists. They were up on a pedestal. They didn't want to give up that to be lowered down to the level of a patient, as Dr. Lowe would have been considered.
That's a good point. That is something that he does bring up, even about his relationship with his wife. He liked the everyday people. He did not really care for intellectuals. And so that was another kind of probably part of his personality that helped him develop this successful method. Marianne?
And to add to that, he was also very conscientious of the cost. So he was also trying to make it cost effective for the patients. And as a group, he was it was more efficient. And
yes,
that it hit their pocket. Nobody likes to be hit their pockets.
Yes, Howard wrote that in the chat. Yes, that it was a very expensive and protracted therapy, the psychoanalytic method. Lisa?
I was gonna say that there was a lot of stigma, and so he really wanted to demonstrate that you might feel helpless, but there was no hopeless case. And like you just said, Judi, he practiced with the people. That's why he came and let them come to his house. And when I speak to professionals, they always say that would never happen today. But he was so committed to his patients that he wanted us to get well.
Yeah, just to, the fact that patients could help themselves was a really novel idea. And most professionals didn't care for that concept.
I think the simplicity of the method. He was all about simplicity and keeping it simple. And I think that ego part of the psychoanalysis and these doctors and all these trainings for something to be that simple, felt maybe it took away from their profession. Like it can't be that easy.
Thank you. Naomi, did you want to make a comment before we close today?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that chapter 16, actually, on page 146, in the middle, was really a turning point, or quite a surprise that he went to that extent, because he almost lost his license. top of that, he was barred from all the public hospitals and private as well. So it's amazing. He's amazing.
Yes, very amazing. I think I'll pick up at the little bit that we're not able to cover. I'll pick up on our next session in March. And happy reading, and we'll talk to you soon. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.